Hi, my name's Katie. This is my channel, Chords Records. Welcome. Please subscribe and like this video if you do like it. Karen Dalton, an incredible 1960s blues singer. If you know her, you know her, but so many people don't. And this video today is about introducing people to the world of Karen Dalton if you're not familiar with her. And even if you are, you might learn a few things. So let me paint a picture here. Karen Dalton was born in 1937, and it's an easy date for me to remember because it's a year after my mum, who is still alive. So she would, if Karen Dalton had lived, she would have been around 88, 89. I'm recording this in 2024. Unfortunately, she died of complications from AIDS in the early 90s after a lifetime of sort of drug addiction and abuse. She was the most extraordinary blues singer from the 60s. So essentially, I'm going to show you a few records of hers that you can get as re-releases. And I would urge anyone who's interested in the history of modern music to look up this incredible artist. So Karen Dalton came onto the scene really in the very early 60s. She was part of that New York, Greenwich Village scene. Bob Dylan, Tim Hardin, Fred Neil, Richard Tucker, all those people performing at the cafes like Cafe Wah, ? She just an extraordinary person. So leading up to that, she arrived in New York sort of in her 20s after already being married twice and divorced twice, had 2 children. And she was an incredible, people called her a folk singer, but she was a blues singer. She had an extraordinary voice, likened to Billie Holiday. One of the liner notes of one of her albums said it was almost like a trumpet sound. It was just a singular note. It wasn't a perfect voice, but it was an extraordinary voice. In one of the liner notes, Nick Cave talks about her being the best voice he's ever heard. So she arrived in New York in the early 60s, so we're talking 1960-61, and had her 12-string guitar and her long-necked, I think 72-fret banjo. I'm making that up, I'm not sure. But it was a long-necked banjo, and she wasn't a songwriter herself. She interpreted other people's songs, and that's really important because her interpretations were unique, individual to her. The most beautiful, beautiful singer. Like, just you could hear the pain or the subtlety or the resonance of life in her singing and playing. So she hung around that scene in the early 60s. She was a kind of protege, if you like, or a disciple of Fred Neil, who obviously went on to write the famous song Everybody's Talking. But he was very present in the 60s and was influencing in the Greenwich Village scene, and was influencing the likes of Tim Hardin, who wrote that famous song Reason to Believe. And why that's important is we'll hear in a minute that Karen Dalton recorded a definitive version of that song. So she hung around in the 60s, but then started dividing her time between the chaos of New York and the kind of that Greenwich Village scene and potentially drug-infused village, Greenwich Village scene. She divided her time between that and then the peace and quiet of Colorado, the big open spaces and the mountains. And she moved there with her soon-to-be husband, Richard Tucker, who she had been playing with. He was a guitarist. And Tim Hardin later joined. The three of them formed kind of an essence of a band at one point and were a trio. And Tim Hardin actually followed them to Colorado because they were such a unit playing music. And there was quite a few famous kind of clubs and bars in Colorado where she ended up, that some of those recordings have been, the attic was one of them, have been kind of captured and released subsequently. She also recorded in a small cabin in Colorado. Someone brought in a 4-track tape, reel-to-reel tape, I think, and recorded that. So all these recordings have been found over the years or released over the years. So there is a little bit of information you can see and hear of Karen Dalton. There's been documentaries made of her, so you can look her up. So let me start with her. So eventually she came out of the sort of the late 60s, having had a decade of this incredible folk singing in bars and clubs. She was notoriously not interested in fame. She'd close her eyes when she was singing. She knew how good she was. That's what was important to her, the music. And she would let people come to her. And eventually she was talked into recording an album. And she released her first album. And that first album was called It's So Hard to Tell Who's Going to Love You Best. So this album was recorded in 1969, and this was her debut album. I have the Record Store Day Black Friday release from 2020. She's done a couple of records. Her music's been released on a couple of Record Store Days. So this was a replica of the Capitol vinyl. It's so great getting these kind of reissues because they're on heavyweight vinyl and they've been remastered and they're beautifully quiet, which for this kind of music is really important. So this Black Friday one, which you can still buy online, was the first time it was released in over a decade. And the songs on here: A Little Bit of Rain, Sweet Substitute, Ribbon Bow, I Love You More Than Words Can Say, the Booker T. Jones, In the Evening, Blues on the Ceiling, Fred Neil song, It Hurts Me Too, How Did the Feeling Feel to You, a Tim Harden song, Right, Wrong Already, and Down on the Street. So that was her first album. It wasn't successful, but then she was talked into recording her next album, and this was going to be a far better produced, in the studio with a lot of Woodstock musicians, in 1971, In My Own Time. This album is a masterpiece. This was the edition that was released as a gatefold, as a reissue by VMP. Beautifully released. RTI pressed it. It was on gold vinyl, but it's still beautifully quiet. Where gold vinyl can be notorious. It was beautiful, kind of this translucent gold vinyl. This album is just, if you own one Karen Dalton album, this second album, she only released 2, this second album is the one to own, In My Own Time. And if you get this VMP edition, you get with it the brilliant liner notes. And the first liner note is a reproduction of a liner note that Lenny Kaye wrote for a different repress a few years earlier. Now, Lenny Kaye, as we know, is the permanent band member and collaborator with Patti Smith, he started with Patti Smith back in the day in the 70s and then rejoined her in the 80s and has been with her ever since. An amazing, and he wrote for a lot of music publications. So he wrote the early liner notes for this, and then the other liner notes are by Nick Cave, who just absolutely loves Karen Dalton. And he talks about one of the songs on here, Something on My Mind, and it's actually the opening, Something on Your Mind. It's actually the opening song. And if I could just read you a little bit, just a few lines. But the one that really stayed with me, and I must have played a million times, is Something on Your Mind. It's just the most extraordinary vocal I've ever heard, I think. And I've heard Billie Holiday, and I guess there's comparisons. But there is something else going on as well in this voice. I was going to say, too, it's a fragile voice, but of course it's not a fragile voice because it's been smashed into a million pieces. So these liner notes are just brilliant. So I would highly recommend getting the Vinyl Me Please reissue from 2022 of this debut album. Once she had released those two albums, and she then kind of started falling into some more troubled times, and as one writer puts it, she went more and more into homelessness, and eventually she was homeless, and she did die in the early 90s, as I said, of AIDS-related complications, and she'd been living with AIDS for 8 or 9 years. So since then, over the decades, the 70s and 80s, her music became very cult, and so many people discovered her and referred to her as a great influence. How I discovered her was through a song called Reason to Believe, a famous Tim Hardin song, Reason to Believe. And I was listening to a Nashville singer, Vagabond, in 2019. She released this single, Reason to Believe, with Courtney Barnett, the Australian singer. And as soon as I heard that song, I thought, I know that song. And of course, I knew the 80s pop Wilson Phillips version of that song. I used to love that song when I was growing up. I was a teenager, early 20s, and I loved that song. I just thought it was a great song. And it was a pop song. It was, charted. And so when I heard Vagabond and and Courtney Barnett's version of it, I thought, what is this song? And I did a little bit of research, and it didn't take me long to discover that, of course, Rod Stewart had covered it in 1971. I knew that version as well. And then that led me back to Karen Dalton, who had released it or had recorded it and sung it many times, of her dear friend Reason to Believe, and that version has also been recorded in the and re-released. So it's been covered hundreds of times, most likely. Karen Dalton's being probably one of the most definitive. So you can find that version of Karen Dalton's Reason to Believe as the first track on this 1966 album. This one has been re-released a few times. It's a fantastic one to get. So it has Reason to Believe on it, and it has a few other standards that she had recorded and released on her proper studio recordings. I'll read you the hype sticker. Newly unearthed recording. Karen Dalton at her most intimate and unfiltered. Simply one of the greatest singers ever. Her voice is so unique, to describe it would take a poet. And Bob Dylan's quote, "My favourite singer in the place was Karen Dalton." This 1966 album, with that first track, Reason to Believe, was recorded in her own cabin on reel to reel in 1966. It was never intended to be released, but someone had the presence to record it. And this reissue of these kind of newly unearthed recordings is such a treasure trove of how she intended her music to be heard. And these were rehearsal recordings, so they're full versions, and it almost could have been an album in and of itself. She sings the Billie Holiday song, God Bless the Child. Honestly, Hallelujah, the not the Leonard Cohen one, The Shiloh Town by Tim Hardin. What else is on here? Don't Make Promises by Tim Hardin. Other Side to This Life, the Fred Neil track. The traditional song Cotton Eye Joe, but it's done so beautifully. And she there's a song Katie Cruel, which she sang so often in New York, and she did release it on one of her albums, that traditional song. So this 1966 album is really worth getting to hear her before she released her first album in 1969. So this is kind of the peak of her playing in bars and pubs. Then the final album I wanted to show you was one that was Record Store Day, Shuckin' Sugar. So again, previously unreleased performance. And it features some of the same songs, but there are some songs on here which have never been heard. So really a beautiful, beautiful singer, blues singer, folk guitarist, who is just an absolute treasure, a national treasure for America in the history of kind of that blues folk scene. And there are threads that you can follow through with Karen Dalton. For example, the man that signed her for that classic second album that Nick Cave wrote the liner notes for in this In My Own Time. The man that signed her, he signed her on his new record label, and he also signed Billy Joel at the time. So there's these beautiful rock and roll threads through, and these albums were coming out at the same time that Linda Ronstadt was starting to play, Emmylou Harris was playing, Joni Mitchell was playing. All these people would have been hearing each other's music. That was just such a ripe time in the American kind of singer-songwriter, folk singer time. Joan Baez, all these people, Barbara Keith, Diane Davidson. There were so many that were around this time. It just fascinates me. So Karen Dalton, really worth checking out if you don't know her. You can stream her. You can look up a lot of these albums online. Of course, the originals are holy grails. If you can find them, pick them up. Just a fantastic treat for the history of music, and her voice is just unbelievable. Okay, I hope you liked this video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.